do the. First off, I want to talk business stuff, so I'm just going to write one. Business. Busyness. Yeah, that looks right. 2 business points. One. There were 2 business points, and now I'm only remembering one of them. First business point, paper prompt number 1 is on Blackboard. So a few classes ago, a few of you asked if I could post the paper prompts a little earlier so you could work ahead, give you more flexibility. Well, they're now up there. If you have any questions, comments, concerns about them, feel free to reach out. We'll be talking about them more in depth in a few weeks, but for now, just know they're up there, and if you want to get a head start, you can go look at them. Number 2, syllabus is changing a little bit. What do I mean? So generally, whenever I change the syllabus, it's never going to mean more work for you. It's just going to mean less. So practically speaking, the main thing is that as of right now, on the syllabus, it has us talking about 3 different theories of concepts. I'm cutting out the third, the stuff on the theory. So basically what that means is the reading for today is also going to be talked about next class, and the reading that's currently assigned for next class will be assigned for all of next week. And the stuff that's currently assigned for next Monday is not ever going to be covered or assigned. So I will send out an updated version of the syllabus with that information on it tomorrow morning at the latest. But just to let you know, also, I guess it's the third to last class. I decided I was tired of hearing my voice, and we're going to have a guest speaker come in and do a little spiel. I'll know more about what he will be talking about closer to the time, but it's going to be on altruism. So we're going to have a class by a psychology professor on altruism, and he might also have a couple guests along with him. So I'm not exactly sure what it's going to be, but I will include on the syllabus. Basically what it means is what we currently have is the second to last class stuff on cognitive dissonance we're not going to cover. So yeah, any questions on that stuff? Again, the syllabus is changing. I will send out a new copy, but all it basically means is what is the latest date you can send in our papers to be checked on drafts? I do not remember the numbers off the top of my head for certain, but I'm pretty sure it says the draft can be turned in. So the final paper's due on March 27th, I'm pretty sure, and I think what I have on the syllabus is Tuesday, March 23rd is the last time I'll look at drafts. It's not on the syllabus, it's on the prompts. So if you check on the prompts, it has the official date. Let me run over here and look at my calendar. Yeah, so I think actually the paper's due on the 26th, Friday, the day before spring break. So it's due on 3/26, and the last time I'll look at drafts is 8 a.m. on 3/23. Yep. If you want me to read over, thank you, Alan, for copying it. Yep, that's what it says. You can check the chat for exactly the wording. But basically, if you want to send me, another thing I'll say off the bat is in terms of reading over drafts, I'm happy to read over drafts as many times as you want to send them. So if you want to send me a draft next week, and then I give you some feedback on it. And when I say send me a draft, I literally mean I will treat it as if it was your final paper, put comments, give suggestions, what I think makes sense, what I think doesn't. I will not tell you exactly what I'm looking for because that would be, kind of defeat the purpose, but I will give you some general suggestions and just highlight things. Basically, you'll get a PDF back that's just like covered in various colored inks and a bunch of typing in it. So, if, however, you get that back, you make feedback, and then you want another round of feedback, I'm happy to give you as many rounds as you want up until this date. Again, with the paper, if you need an extension on the paper, because coming up on that week, shit hits the fan for you, a bunch of stuff happens, and you just need a little more time, reach out, we'll figure something out, don't stress about it. All right. And we will be talking about what I'm looking for with papers and how to approach them and everything closer to the time it's due. You've got 27 days. So you've got about 4 weeks until the paper's due. It's like 3 2/3 weeks. So you've got some time. But if you want to get ahead, it's there for you. All right. Any last questions on this? Again, on the, oh, yes.
Is the reading for today the Lawrence and Margolis one?
Yes, the Lawrence and
Okay.
Margolis, and it's divided into 3 parts, or at least on the syllabus today. Oh, Ryan asked, you only have to write about 1 prompt. Yes, 1 of the 4 prompts. There are 4 total. You choose 1 of them. You do not have to write on more than 1. Back to Alan's question, though, it was the Lawrence and Margolis, but only the first section that didn't have big X's on it, and then also the section on the classical theory of concepts. What it's going to be now, I'll just write this up for those of you who don't feel like waiting until tomorrow. Here's what the schedule is going to look like. Today, Wednesday, that's not how you spell Wednesday. Wednesday starts with an W. Wednesday, 3. Monday, next. I don't know the number. Wednesday, next. So the way this is going to work is let me just pull up the syllabus, it'll be easier. So as of right now, you had pages 1 through 27 of the Margolis to read. So what it's going to be is 1 to 27, no new, 27 to 43, no new. So the part that is pages 43 to 51 is off the syllabus. This is what the schedule for the next 2 weeks is going to look like. I will send out a new copy of the syllabus with this, but if you want to write it down, so no new readings for Wednesday. We're just going to be finishing up what we're talking about today, which is the Lawrence and Margolis, page 1 to 27. All right. Any other business questions before I start? All right, awesome. So what's the topic for today? First off, today's topic is what?
Concepts.
Concepts. What is a concept? Why are we talking about concepts? So given from the reading or your own thoughts on it or your own things from other classes, what is meant by a concept?
It's like when an idea or like a word is said, and then you make, I don't know, that word creates an idea in your head, and then
Yeah, so I'm now going to erase this because I need the board. So things we can say about concepts is, generally speaking, we think of them as the things that serve as word meanings. So when I say the word dog, that triggers in me the idea of a dog, or to use psychology terminology, it activates my concept dog. So that's what we're talking about with concepts. They're the things that are activated. Now, how does this tie in with what we talked about last class? Remember last class, we were talking about the representational theory of mind. And the idea of the representational theory of mind is, in your head, you have mental symbols. So we said, like, if here's a church, and here's a person standing next to the church, you might have the thought, the man is next to the church. And the way that works is this scene here corresponds to a set of mental symbols in your head. So we can call it something like this. Circle, square. So that's what's in your head. And this here corresponds to what's over here. Or more specifically, this symbol corresponds to the church. This symbol corresponds to the relationship next to, and this symbol corresponds to the man, or something along those lines. Now, another way of talking about this, these symbols here are the concepts. Another way to think about concepts is they are the symbols that form the parts of thought. They are the building blocks out of which more complicated thoughts are made. So what is it to have a belief that the man is next to the church? Well, it's to have a series of concepts joined together that you stand in a believey relationship to. That's what it means on the representational theory of mind, to have the belief the man is next to the church. So when we're studying concepts, what we're doing is just studying what is the nature of these mental symbols, the things out of which our thoughts are created. And amongst other things, we like to think that this concept here, not only is it the thing that forms, it forms the more complex thought, it's part of the more complex thought, the man is next to the church. It's also the meaning of the word, English word, church. It would also be the meaning of the, why can't I think of the word for church in any other language right now? It would also
Iglesia.
say that again. Oh,
Iglesia.
Église. That's French. Sorry, I talked over you, Conrad.
I said iglesia. I think that's Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
And then kościół is in Polish.
All right, my Polish spelling is awful, so I'm just going to Iglesia. Église in French, Iglesia. All of these words have the same meaning in Russian, okay? So all of these words in different languages, they all pick out the same concept. This concept, which we in English would say is church, which corresponds to this symbol in the head. That's what we mean by a concept in psychology. And when philosophers use the term in the psychological way, and when we're using it this class, that's what we mean by a concept, the building blocks that correspond to things in the world and which are the meanings of our words. These lexical items, these words, their meaning is a concept. And it's because of that concept that we're able to grasp the meanings of more complex sentences. So when we grasp the sentence, the man is next to the church, what it is the concept for church, concept for next to, concept for man, in our head represented. All right, let me write this down. So that's what we mean by concepts. They're these building blocks of thought, and they're the things that correspond to the meanings of words. And they are a major topic within psychology, and they're a very nice thing right on the border of philosophy and psychology, because there's a lot of questions philosophers have about them, and a lot of questions that psychologists have, and a lot of overlap where the two groups work together. And really, concepts is one of the areas that philosophers and psychologists and neuroscientists and everybody has really influenced each other to a high degree. So here is our concept up on the board. Say this was our concept for church. What you can ask at this point is a few different things. Well, what are some questions you might have at this point? If I say this is the mental symbol for church, this is just my stand-in for it. What are some questions that somebody might have? If we're saying these are the building blocks of thought, one thing we're going to ask is why care about concepts? And then there's a lot of other questions you might have. So first off, I want to just ask you all, why should we care about concepts? Why should we take the time to study them if we're interested in psychology? Well, what are some of the things you've studied in a psychology class? Just generally speaking. Marie?
Relationships.
So relationships, you mean in terms of interpersonal relationships?
Yeah.
So think about the things we study in psychology. Interpersonal / social relationships. So social psych type stuff. I'm just going to put social psych. When you're interacting with somebody and you're interacting with them, it's not just like they are immediately just controlling you directly. Rather, they are influencing you in a complex sort of way. So for instance, when you have, in a psychology class, you might study a relationship, the way that the relationship between fathers and sons changes across cultures. Well, how would you explain the differences in that case? One thing you'd say is the differences between those relationships affect our different concepts of what a father is supposed to be in those societies. So even something like social psych, to even understand the way in which social interactions work, it's always filtered through our ideas about those relationships. So if you're thinking about a peer group versus an authority figure, the way that you go about thinking and the way those interactions affect you is in large part through affecting your concepts about those things. What are some other topics that people find fascinating or that get studied a lot in psychology?
Maybe
Say that again, Ryan, you cut out.
maybe like learning it or like communication.
Learning is, I'm going to steal learning. What is learning? What is it to learn something new?
Could be mimicking.
To learn
So
new
mimicking-
concepts.
Mimicking, or I think that was you, Mikhail, mimicking, and it seems like when you're mimicking someone, sometimes it's just pure behavioral mimicking. But oftentimes when you learn something new, like when you learn that London is the capital of the United Kingdom, what you've done is you've gained a concept, the concept of London. So another thing, learning is by its very nature gaining of concepts to control your information. Or another type of learning is when you learn that two different things you've thought of before are in some way related to each other. So if you learn that you had the concept of dog and you had the concept of wolf, and then at some point you learn that dogs are descended from wolves. So learning is in many cases, it's something that is at its very core made up of concepts. So we care about concepts insofar as we care about psychology. We can't really understand a lot of the major topics in psychology without studying and understanding concepts. So that's why concepts is a really big topic and something worth studying. To understand the nature of thought, one of the things that goes into that is understanding the building blocks out of which our thoughts are made. So that's why we care about concepts. Now, once we've established that we care about concepts, what are a lot of other questions that come up? And what I want to do in this little part of the class is just highlight some of the key questions. Some of them came up in the reading. Others are just other sorts of questions that a person might ask and which have been discussed in psychology and philosophy, but which we won't necessarily get a chance to do readings on, but I want to bring up. So if I tell you concepts are the building blocks of thought, what is it something that you personally, there's no wrong answers here, might wonder about these things, these building blocks of thoughts, the thing that words correspond to, are they abstract? What is their nature? Are they abstract? So what do we mean by abstract here?
Like,
Uh,
are
No, you can go ahead, Marie.
yeah, so like, are they these things that can be broken down, or are they just kind of ideas that are floating around?
Yeah, so one thing we might wonder about, though, and this ties in with another thing, is in what sense are concepts like eternal, out there, the same for everybody? So when people talk about like the number 3, we think about the number 3 as some magical existing thing, the number that we all have a thought of. And why is it you and I can both know that 3 + 3 = 6? Well, we both have a grasp of the number 3, whatever the hell that means, and it exists in some magical abstract realm. Now, are concepts like that, or should we instead that multiple people can grasp, or should we think of concepts as things in the head that are different for everybody and are really grounded for each individual person? And if they're grounded for each individual person, is it that they are made up out of parts that together form the concepts that each person has? Or should we instead think of them as some sort of special whole, some sort of unified entity that is only defined in, doesn't have parts? It's just something that cannot be divided. So another thing I want to jump off of here is, do they have parts? So for instance, we'd say that the English word cat corresponds to the concept cat. And to be clear, this right here is my way of quickly pointing to a concept. I'm not saying that what's in our head is actually the English word. I'm just using these strings of letters just so I can put something on the board. Really, it could just be a drawing or whatever. So one thing you might say is this just a universal whole, or is rather the concept cat made up of smaller parts, things like, I don't know, furry and animal? Or is it maybe like made up of parts like takes up physical space or actual? These are the sorts of things we can ask as well. So what is their nature? Are they abstract things? Are they concrete? This is something which is a great question, which philosophy and philosophy especially has really asked a lot. We will unfortunately not be able to address it too much. Do they have parts? This one we will be coming back to. in a minute. What are some other questions you might have?
I would ask, like, is it like definite, or is there fluidity to concepts?
So like, do concepts change over time, do you mean?
Yeah, or like, is it set?
Concepts change. So this is another question, and we can ask, do concepts change for a person in their individual minds? And then separately, we can ask a question, can concepts change across history? So you might want to, and why would this be relevant? Well, it's going to change how we characterize changes in history. So we might say something like the concept slavery. The concept slavery as it exists for most of us today, or our individual concepts of slavery, seem in some sense very closely intertwined with the idea of negative or bad, because slavery was a terrible institution that led to a lot of pain. But if you go back 2,000, 3,000 years when slavery was common around the world, it might not have had that sort of moral connotation. Do we want to say that what's happened is there was one concept, slavery, that was replaced by a different concept and we just so happened to use the word? Or is it that literally there was the concept slavery has shifted over time? And why does this matter? Well, it might matter for how you teach people new ideas. Like if your goal is to get people to understand that slavery is a bad thing, do you need to instill in them a new concept, or is it a matter of changing something that's already there? And how you go about that is going to affect how you would go about teaching it in a learning environment in a classroom. Another thing you might ask is, do individual concepts change? So for instance, if somebody's raised in a racist household, such that in their mind, somebody of X race is bad or wrong or somehow lesser, and if we want them to, that idea to change, do we have to somehow alter their concept of what it is to be of that race? Or do we instead try to get rid of that concept and replace it by a new concept? Or do we need to change the language itself and stop talking about this and come up with a new term? These are all terms that are affected by this psychological question, do concepts change, or how do our concepts change? What are some more we might have? There are a couple more I just want to quickly address. So I'll see if anybody brings them up, and if not, I will address those ones. But any other things people have about these building blocks of our head? What are they like? What are some other questions you might have about them?
I'm thinking about like associations, but I can't pinpoint what I'm trying to say.
Well, let me take the word association and run with it. So one could just be, how are concepts related? So how is it that they relate to each other? Are they set up in a sort of hierarchy where what it takes for one concept to activate another concept is for it to, in some sense, be an example of it? So in this sense, the way our concepts are associated is it animal? And then underneath our concept of animal, understood as an example of an animal, are cats and dogs? Or is it rather thought of as a web, in which you can think of it as all it is for concepts to be related is for there to be connections between them? So you'd have your cat concept related to your dog concept, related to your frog concept. And all it means then is, one thing you could think is the nature of what it is to think is going to depend on this structure. Now, what do I mean by that? We've all had trains of thought where one thing leads to another, leads to another. And well, why is it that if you think of the word cat, you'll very quickly be more likely to think of the word dog next? Well, one answer would simply be that you've heard these together a lot, and they're associated together in your mind such that activating one will activate the other. It's a mechanical process. Another one, though, might be that the reason is what you think is something along the lines of, oh, I've thought of cat. I know cat is an animal. What is another animal? Well, another animal is a dog. This would suggest that our mind is more rational and it's less mechanical. Now, why would that sort of question be interesting? Another thing, Jazim says they're both pets. You might say, rather than both being animal, they're both pets, which is underneath the type animal. So how these concepts are structured or relate to each other in your head is going to affect things and affect how you think about changing people's concepts, or how you think about why they are thinking the way they are. Now, that was a very vague way of saying. To take a concrete example, implicit bias. Implicit bias is studies people have done in which they find even people who say things like, I'm not at all racist, I believe everyone is equal of any race. If you put these people in an environmental or in a psychological experiment and give them pictures of Black people holding things and pictures of white people holding things, so the experiment runs like this. You show someone a picture of a Black person and they're holding something. It's either a gun or a cell phone. You show them a picture of a white person holding something. It's either a gun or a cell phone. They're flashed in front of you for a split second, and you're then asked, if it's a gun, press left. If it's a cell phone, press right. Does anyone know what the studies have found? Like, you could probably predict it based on what you know about the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that from my intro psychology course, actually. And the people who claim they weren't racist still, it activated a part in their brain for fear.
Yeah, and so basically what you find is when people make mistakes in these studies, they're far more likely to incorrectly say that a Black person is holding a gun when they're actually holding a cell phone, and incorrectly say a white person is holding a cell phone when they were actually holding a gun. And this applies almost universally across the American population. And so this implicit bias, you might wonder, well, why is it that these people are thinking in this way? Is it simply that they've seen movies in which there was implicit racism in the movie, and they see the news, and therefore they formed a mechanical connection through the societal racism in the nation they live to associate person of color bad? It's just like a mechanical thing, and the only way to get them to stop feeling that, because it's not a rational thought, it's just in the same way that, like, if you've had nasty food, you then throw up, you never want to have that nasty food again. The only way to get somebody to stop having that feeling is to give them the same food and not have them feel sick over and over again. It's a purely mechanical process. So if you think that concepts are related to one another in this sort of mechanical way, and you want to get somebody to stop associating person of color with bad, even on an unconscious level, what you're going to want to do is counter condition them. If, however, you think these are related in some sort of rational way, such that they're hierarchically organized, there's like a rationality to this system, the way you're going to have to teach people to stop being racist is actually give them arguments like, you do this thing, you should stop doing this thing. This thing you're doing shows that you are racist, even if you don't think you are. So something like, how do you teach people to be less racist? Well, your answer to that is going to depend on how you think the concepts in your head are related to each other. So that's another question that comes up. Another thing I want to briefly point to, number 6, question, where do they come from? So if we have these concepts in our head, things like dog, cat, simple question, where do they come from? How do they get in there in the first place? I'm going to erase this right here because this is something I want to address briefly, because these are terms you're probably either have heard or will hear at some point, either in a philosophy or a psychology class. So what are the possible answers for where do these concepts come from? We've got a concept dog. Where does it come from? So one idea is that it comes from our senses or perception. And so the idea would be that a concept dog is ultimately something which can be broken down into past sensory experiences. We kind of copy our experience of a dog. And what the concept dog then is something copied from these senses. And the idea would be, one thing you could say is every single idea you have in your head is copied from your senses ultimately. And does anyone know what this term is? It's a term that gets thrown around in psychology and philosophy. What is somebody who believes that everything you've learned in your head comes from experience. Ultimately, everything, yes, empiricist. So an empiricist is somebody who believes all concepts are either A, learned directly from experience, or B, made up of parts learned from experience. So this idea here that everything, every concept in your head, how did it get in there? Ultimately from your senses, is a view called empiricism, which is still very alive in psychology today, is still the debate between empiricism and those who are not empiricists goes all the way back to about the 1600s and is still a hot button topic where people argue about, can everything in the human mind ultimately be explained by saying it's copied from experience? Or what's the flip side of this? What's the other position you could have? If not everything is copied from experience, it's called rationalism. And if you don't think it's copied from experience, how did it get in there in the first place? Anyone know?
It's like pure thought.
Yeah, it's basically there to begin with. The idea is empiricists think there's nothing in your mind. You are a blank slate when you're born. And this blank slate just basically copies things from experience, makes simple concepts. Those simple complex concepts get combined together, and every complex thought you've ever had ultimately breaks down to those simple parts. And what it is to grow up and learn is to go from this blank slate with nothing inside into a complex being by copying things from experience. Rationalists, or a term that often gets thrown around these days in its place, is nativist, is somebody who believes some concepts, or I guess we are born with some primitive concepts. So maybe something like cause. How do you learn that there's one thing causes another? Well, you are already born with the concept of cause, and you kind of project it onto your experiences. So when you see one thing hit another, you're pre-programmed to know that thing is a cause. You're programmed to know that this is a cause, and therefore your mind projects on that. Now, again, these sorts of things matter in terms of things like learning. If you are born with the wrong concepts, or if you aren't born with certain concepts, then this means that you aren't, if you're a nativist and you think you're born with certain concepts, if you're born with the wrong concepts, you're never going to be able to get rid of them because they're always there. Another thing, an empiricist thinks that ultimately any single person is capable of any thought so long as they learn in the right way and are trained. For a rationalist or nativist, the idea is there are certain things you're just born with that constrain what is going to be possible for you as a human. As a human being, you are going to see things in color, or at the very least, you're going to see things in color provided that your eyes are functioning. So the idea would be that certain concepts are just in there, and you are, in some sense, your possibilities and the possibilities for what you can think are somehow constrained. It's not just about your experience. And these sorts of differences are going to come up in things like education theory. And how is it that you go about making someone a good person? Is there a large genetic component? If there is, how do you offset that? These are the sorts of issues that are tied in with concepts. Any other things people want to address or ideas? And basically the goal of this, if none of this stuck in your head, that's fine. We're not going to be discussing many of these things, but they're terms that are useful to know. If you ever take a psychology class, you will see phrases like nativism. You can look at like historical psychologists that you've read in your intro psych class, like Piaget, Skinner. These sorts of people classified themselves as falling into one of these camps. So for instance, Skinner was a hardcore empiricist. He believed everything was taught. It was just behavior. Nothing was in there. And so you can understand his ideas better if you've understood this, or if you're familiar with this term empiricism. Modern linguistics is very much tied in with these nativist tendencies, this idea that you're born with certain linguistic abilities and the ability to grasp certain types of meanings. And so one of the big debates in linguistics is, can you explain the complexity of human language in an empiricist way, or do you need a nativist understanding? And this is going to have implications for things like, if we ever want to teach a robot to actually speak and not just parrot things to us, we'll need to take this sort of thing into consideration. All right, any other questions on concepts, why they're interesting, what sorts of issues come up with them, or anything like that? All right, we're good. All right, let me erase. So, what is the topic that we are going to be looking at having to do with concepts, or what particular question about concepts are we going to be discussing? Anyone want to shout it out from the reading, or I can just put it up here?
Classical theory versus, I forgot the other one, prototype theory?
Yes, classical and prototype, which are both views about what aspect of concepts?
Like how they can be defined, I believe.
So not specific, not generally how they can be defined, but what their structure is, or what their internal structure is. So what do I mean by this? Or what exactly does this mean in this context? Well, think of it this way. A concept is about something in the world. So for instance, this right here is about something. It represents something. What does it represent?
A deer.
A deer. It represents deer. Now, this also represents deer. These two have the same representational content. They both pick out deer. They're both about deer. They can both be, if I say like brown, or say here, the deer is green, and here we go. These both represent the idea that the deer is green, but they do so in a different way. They have different structures and a different means for representing this fact. And now, because they have different structures, they're going to be good for different things, and they're going to be able to convey information in slightly different ways. So the deer is green. You can kind of divide it up into parts. This one, you could also divide it up into parts, but you could divide it however you want. So this is a difference in structure. And you can see how the difference in structure is going to affect the sorts of conclusions. Also, they affect what you can do with it. Now, if this was beautifully drawn, you might hang this in your house. You would never hang the phrase, the deer is green, in the house. You might hang like live, laugh, love. But outside of that, you're not going to hang like a series of words on your wall. The deer, you might hang a picture of a deer, though. So you can see the structure matters. Also, things like, even if you have all the same rooms in your apartment, two people have all the same rooms in their apartment and all the same size, how they're structured or how they're related to each other has a big impact on different sorts of things. So for instance, if your apartment has one bathroom, one bedroom, one living room, one kitchen, and they're arranged like this, it's going to be a pain. Like if this is the bedroom, this is the bathroom, here's the living room, and here's the kitchen, and here's the front door, versus a setup like this. There's going to, even though it's the same rooms, the difference in structure is going to mean it's probably much easier to have a party in this house than this house. It also means that if you were to have guests and you made them sleep in the living room, then every time they wanted to use the bathroom, they'd have to walk through your bedroom, which would be a pain. So here's another sense, structure matters. So what we're going to be talking about is how are concepts structured, and specifically, how are complex concepts structured? And this is a question that is one of the major ones in psychology and really at the core of a lot of questions in cognitive science philosophy, and an area in which cognitive science really has drawn from both psychologists and philosophers and has done a lot of really interesting research. So I think this is a really good one to show how philosophy and psychology can overlap. So what we're going to be doing is talking about the different types of, or two of the main theories that people have held as to how complex concepts are structured and what the implications are for the nature of human thought and why we care about these things in trying to understand how humans think, and what the implications are for things like the nature of learning, for the nature of getting things right, the nature of believing a truth. So any questions thus far about what I just mean by structure? Just basically, how are the parts organized together? In the same way an apartment, its structure is a matter of how its rooms are organized because the rooms are part of the apartment. How is this complex concept structured is how are its parts organized, or what parts does it have and how do those parts relate to each other? So is everyone on board with this? All right. So just one thing I want to say about complex concepts is why think there are complex concepts. And by this, I mean, why think that concepts have parts to them? Anyone have any ideas for why we think that a certain concepts are complex and have parts to them? Well, let's go with a math concept. A triangle. We all have the concept triangle. Now, you could say that a triangle is a concept like a whole, it's not made up out of parts. But here's a cool fact about triangles. If you learn what an angle is, and you learn what the number 3 means, then you seem able to, even if you've never heard of a triangle before, you can imagine a triangle. Just like I can tell you, like, a 77-sided object. You can now imagine, and if you wanted, you could draw out what a 77-sided object was. Why? Because you have the concept angle and you have the concept 77. So this suggests that a concept like triangle or a concept like 77-sided object is something that you can construct or create in your own mind. And because of this, you're able to think that, well, if this is how we, in some sense, if thinking a concept is possible so long as you can think of some things related or parts to it, then it seems that the concept itself is a complex thing made up out of parts. Do you understand what I mean by that? It seems like to think 77-sided object, you have to know 77 and angle, or side, I guess, 77-sided. But so long as you know this and you know this, you're going to be able to have the thought of the complex object. And it seems like for many sorts of concepts, it's like that. So when you learned what a, I don't know, when you learned what summer was, it seemed like you learned it was a season and it was the hot one. Like, so as long as you knew what it was to be warm and what seasons are, you could then figure out what summer was. So this is why people typically think of concepts as there being some complex concepts. Also, it seems like there are many things that when we grasp them for the first time, the way we go about it is we just stick other concepts together. So like, we have a concept of drugs. We have a concept of sniffing. And we have a concept of dog. Well, it seems like there's also, we have the concept of drug sniffing dog. What is it? It's a dog that sniffs drugs. And it seems like our concept associated with this is complex. It's made up out of parts. So that's what we mean by a complex concept. That's why people think there are complex concepts. Now the question is, how should we think of them structured? What should we think of them like? What is the nature of a concept? And what are the natures of its parts? So the first view is what is typically called the classical view of concepts. And the classical view of concepts is basically our common sense view of what a concept is. And what is our common sense view of what a concept is? Well, if somebody comes along and asks you, what's a cat? What do you give them? what do you say to them?
Animal, 4 legs, fur, whiskers,
Yeah.
meows.
So basically, what are you doing? You're laying out a bunch of characteristics in something of a definition. So the classical view of concepts is a definitional one. What is in your head? What is it to have the concept cat in your head? Well, it's to have a symbol that is itself made up out of parts that are true of that thing. So your concept cat is going to be things like animal. It's going to be things like fur. Maybe is going to have something like chases mice, whiskers. What is your concept of triangle on the classical view? What is a triangle?
3 sides, 3 angles.
3-sided shape, 3-angled shape. It's also going to be like 2D because whatever that means. But yeah, and so if the idea would be that any concept you have can ultimately be broken down into these sorts of parts. So that is the classical view of concepts, and often the way we go about our everyday life. We typically think of our concepts are a way of thinking about things out in the world. So our concept of cat, by having that, we're able to think about cats. And what is our concept cat? Well, it's just this definition in our head that allows us to go around and pick out cats by their features. So in a certain sense, the structure of a concept is just being made up out of parts. And you can see how on this view, we have a very neat idea of how we would learn a new concept. To learn a new, actually, let me come back to that for 1 second. So the classical view of concepts is this definitional one. Any questions thus far about this classic view of what it is to, like, what is the mental symbol in your head? It's basically a definition. It's a definition of what counts as a cat. It's a definition of what counts as a triangle. It's a definition of what counts as, another classic one we'll be talking about a lot is Bachelor. Unmarried adult male. This is one that philosophers love to talk about. So this is what we mean by a concept. So is everyone on board with what the classical view is in terms of just the basics? All right. So if our complex concepts are these definitional things, why do we care about this, or what is the benefit, or why do people think that concepts are structured in this way? Why is this our common sense intro view? Why was this the view that was first introduced by Plato and was dominant and basically more or less unchallenged in the mainstream of thought until around like 1950? So we have from about like 300 BCE to 1950, this was the view of concepts that was dominant. What is so good about this view? Why do we think that this is the correct view? Why did people think that the nature of our thought was built up out of this type of concept? Well, there are a lot of different reasons, but does anyone have any things like off the bat, either that you got from the readings or that you can just think of why this classic view was so popular?
I think foremost, it's super like not complicated.
Yeah, it's really straightforward. And it really gels with common sense. When somebody asks you, what's a so-and-so, you typically give them a definition. And when you think you understand something, it's because you can give a definition of it. When you learned like a new sport, how many of you have tried to learn a sport that is from a nation you did not grow up in? Or you never watched as a kid? Like, you just are sitting there and you have no, I mean, I've tried to understand cricket. I've tried to understand rugby. I've tried to understand Australian rules football. No idea what's going on. And why? It's because I can't like lay out and define the rules of it. the difference between me and somebody who has a full grasp of this idea or knows what it is, has a good concept of it, can give me a definition. Also, think about what's going on when two people argue together. We have lots of arguments about things that, in some sense, they're silly arguments. But the fact that we have these arguments makes a nice explanation for what we're doing is we're arguing about what goes into the definition of this thing or what counts as in the concept. So for instance, think about that lovely internet discussion, is water wet? People loved arguing about, is water wet? What are people discussing in this case? You have people on the internet arguing, should the concept water include the property wetness? And it seems like what people are disagreeing about is whether that is one of the characteristic features of water. When you think of water, is wetness included in that? This is a debate people actually have. Or think about people who have an argument about sports. Sports is just such a great example of people arguing over dumb shit, which is why I bring it up all the time. But sports is something you have one person's arguing Tom Brady's the greatest quarterback ever, and another person argues somebody else is. And very often what they'll argue about is not like, they don't have a disagreement over who threw more yards. Like that is written down on a piece of paper somewhere. Instead, they have an argument about what qualifies as being the greatest quarterback of all time. Does the number of championships matter? Does our concept of greatest quarterback of all time, does that need to include the most championships won? Or is it the most athletic? How should we weigh these things? These sorts of disagreements are nicely captured by this common sense classical view of what concepts are. It just gels really nicely with our everyday lives. When you have debates, like, is this right? Is this wrong? Well, it seems like a lot of the time what you're discussing is, what does it take to count as being right? Is to do the right thing, to do the thing that causes the most pleasure in the world? Is it to do the thing that treats people with respect? What we're doing is kind of unpacking our concept of the right thing. So that's one of the first reasons. It's very straightforward. It gels with common sense. Another thing, and this is one of the major reasons that psychologists really liked it, especially early on, learning is easy to explain, and a lot of our actual learning progression gels with classical theory. So what do I mean by this? This idea that it's easy to explain why we learn things. Well, think about in your head, what order do children learn things in? What comes first? Learning counting or learning addition?
Counting.
Counting comes first, then comes addition, then usually comes subtraction, then it's a multiplication and division, and somewhere along the line they end up doing calculus. They don't ever start with calculus. No child is taught, like, you're not like in kindergarten, you're like, all right, little Johnny, time for you to learn calculus. Why not? Why is it that you start with the counting?
They're building blocks.
Yeah, it's building blocks. It looks like when you learn calculus, what you have to do is you cannot learn calculus until you understand algebra, and you cannot learn algebra until you understand pre-algebra, and you can't do that until you understand division and subtraction and addition and the numbers. So it looks like when you actually look at how children learn, very often the learning involves taking simpler things and building them up to make more complicated things. In the same way that with these concepts, something like Bachelor, it seems like you don't know what a bachelor is, and by bachelor I mean unmarried adult male. It seems like preconditions to learning Bachelor is you have to learn what a male is, you have to learn what marriage is, and you have to learn what it is to be an adult. So it seems like not only that, as soon as you've learned what an adult is, what marriage is and what a male is, it seems like you can now grasp the concept bachelor. So it seems like learning is a very simple thing to explain on this classical theory and gels with what we actually observe. We start as a species, as anything, you start simple and then learn more complex concepts. You didn't learn what anti-disestablishmentarianism was until you learned what like every one of those subwords was. You can't learn what an anti-missile missile is until you've learned what a missile is. So that's another thing, is it gels very nicely with our understanding of learning. What are some other things that makes the classical theory of concepts so popular and so valuable, or seemed so valuable to people for such a long time? There's 3 more we have to discuss. Analyticity. Analyticity, aboutness, and all right, I'm going to erase the top part of the board, the first 2. Does everyone have these? That the idea is that this version or this view of concepts gels with common sense, and another one is that it's easy to explain learning. Everyone got that? All right. So the last 2, or the last 3, what order do you all want to go in? I really don't care. It's totally up to you. Analyticity, categorization, and aboutness. Any strong views? We're going to cover them all, so somebody shout something out.
Analyticity.
All right, analyticity. Analytic. Now, how many people have taken a philosophy class and seen these words? Analytic versus synthetic. Has anyone seen these before? Okay. Analytic and synthetic is a famous distinction within philosophy. Does anyone want to try to explain what the difference is between an analytic truth and a synthetic truth? This is one of the most famously argued about definitions in philosophy, but teaching a philosophy class, I would be remiss if I did not bring it up. So basically, the idea of analytic versus synthetic is it's a difference in terms of the nature of a true statement or a truth. And it's specifically a difference with respect to the grounding or the what makes that thing true. So think about it this way. There's a dog in the room, therefore there's an animal in the room, versus there's a dog in the room, therefore there's one of my favorite things in the room. Now, these, if there was actually a dog in this room right now, these would both be true. There's a dog in the room, therefore there's an animal in the room. And it would also be true, there's a dog in the room, therefore there's one of my favorite things in the room. But you see the difference between them. There's something of a difference here between the two. What's the difference? Can anyone try to point to what the difference is?
One includes an opinion.
So yeah, so this one includes an opinion. And more importantly for this sense, you wouldn't know this one. This one is capable of teaching you something new. This tells you something that you didn't know before, namely that I really like dogs. This one also is something you wouldn't be able to know whether this is true or false without going and asking me my opinion. You'd have to get further information. What about this one? Do you have to look at the world to know that the second sentence is true if the first one is? If you know there's a dog in the room, then you don't have to do anything else. It's just known, like, by definition of what a dog is. It's got to be true that there's an animal in the room. It's got to be the case that if there's a dog in the room, there's an animal in the room. There's no more information here because this, in some sense, is a part of the definition of that. In this case, this bit here is not a definitional truth. It doesn't just fall out of the fact that it's a dog, that it's my favorite thing. You have to go out in the world and gain that information separately. So that's the difference between analytic versus synthetic. And now, whether analytic and synthetic actually exists is a great debate within philosophy, but a lot of people think there's something fundamentally different between something that is a definitional truth and something that just so happens to be true, or something that is true not by definition, but because of some additional fact in the world. And this second one here is said to be synthetic. It's synthetic because what does synthetic mean? Like, what is synthetic rubber, or what is something that's synthesized? Well, it's taking multiple things and putting them together. So in this case, you're taking one truth and synthesizing it with another to get the overall thing. In this case, the analytic one, you don't need to do that synthesizing. So why is this relevant to concepts? Well, this difference, if you accept that it exists, which a lot of people do, we want to explain why is it, what is it about the relationship between dog and animal that's different than the relationship between dog and prof's fave things. Well, what you would say is, what would a classical theory of concepts say? Why would it be able to capture this difference here? According to the classical theory, which of these is going to be a part of our concept dog? Say that again, Alan, you cut out.
Animal.
Yeah, so the classical theory of concepts, which says that our definition of what a concept is a definition. Well, it's going to say that one of the defining features of a dog is that it's an animal. It's not going to say that one of the defining features is that it's one of the professor's favorite things. That's some additional information you've learned about dogs, but that's not part of what defines your concept dog. So that's how you capture the difference between analytic and synthetic truths for a classical theory. And a lot of people like this difference. They want to be able to say that there are some things you can learn just by knowing the definition of something else. For instance, a lot of people like mathematics seems in a lot of ways like it's analytic. Like, as soon as you know what even number means, you can immediately know all sorts of other things. You don't have to go out in the world and be like, all right, that's two things, that's even. That's four things, that's even. It's just by knowing what even means, you can then think about it and know the truth. And why? Why does this make sense? How do you capture this? Why do we have these judgments? Well, the idea is that that is a definitional part of our concept of number. All right. The last things I said was categorization. Actually, let me pause for a sec. Did that make sense to everyone? Or enough sense that when we cover it again next class, briefly at the start, we'll understand it well enough? Okay.
I have
Great.
a quick question.
Yeah.
Last week on Wednesday, we were only talking about folders still, right?
Yes.
Okay, I guess I got confused by the syllabus.
Yeah. So here's what ended up happening with the syllabus is basically the stuff, the Margolis only reading was, if you didn't do the reading for today, don't worry about it. We're going to cover it next class as well. Just read the 1 through 27 for today, for next class as well. And you can treat this as like a very nice long preview of what you'll be reading. But basically, the way that this article was structured was just, and the initial Margolis one, I think it was the only Margolis there was just a few pages of. That was just kind of like the tying the two parts together, explaining how this idea of concepts ties in with the representational theory of mind. So that was my fault. I should have been clearer about those readings. So that was on my end. So if this is making less sense than it would have otherwise, don't worry, we'll be going over it all again next class to some, more or less some degree. Because next class, we're just going to be explaining, despite all these great things, why most theorists today do not accept the classical theory of concepts as it is.
Okay.
All right, yeah. All right, so one thing we like to say, one of the types of truths we like to gain, or one of the main ways we like to gain information, is we meet a new individual. This new individual is something we've not encountered before, this particular individual, and yet we're able to say what type of thing it is. So for instance, I meet something that looks like this for the first time. This is Fluffy. I meet Fluffy for the first time, and I immediately go, oh, Fluffy's a cat. What have I done? I have categorized Fluffy. How do I do this? What is it to categorize Fluffy as a cat, and how am I able to do this? Well, the classical theory of concepts gives a very nice explanation for how I immediately know Fluffy's a cat. What do? Well, I've got the concept cat. And in this concept are things like whiskers, meows, eats mice, poops in litter box. So what I do is I come across Fluffy for the first time, and I see Fluffy meowing, and I see that Fluffy has whiskers, and I see Fluffy eating a mouse, and I see it pooping in a litter box. Well, now I go, oh, that must be a cat. I've now categorized Fluffy as a cat. We also can explain something which Grace brought up last time, which is when children mischaracterize things for the first time. So a child, first time in their life, they have a pet dog, they've seen dogs many times. Let's say they have like a little Shih Tzu or something relatively small that's about cat sized. Well, the first time they come across Fluffy, what might they do? What might they do? They might say, oh, doggy. And why do they do this? Well, because they had their concept dog, they had a concept for dog, but they didn't yet have a concept for cat. So they apply their small furry concept, and it applies to Fluffy. Their parent says, no, that's not a dog, that's a cat. So now what do? Well, they create a new concept, and this can also have furry and small, but then they realize meow goes over here and not over there. Also, they might, as they learn a new thing about a dog, they might learn that dogs don't only have to be small, they come in many different sizes. They also know that they don't have to necessarily be furry, because we've got dogs like those Mexican hairless dogs that don't have hair. So then we have like barks and other sorts of things that define dogs. So it looks like the idea of giving a nice categorization of new objects or new individuals, or why is it so easy to learn that like this type of animal has these properties? Well, if we have definitional answers, it's pretty straightforward and easy to do. All right, any last questions on this part here? We have 5 minutes left. And so rather than covering the last one, the aboutness one, I'm going to save that for next class because it leads nicely into our discussion of problems with the classical theory of concepts. I just want to kind of review what we talked about today, why it was important, and answer any questions about anything so far. Anyone have, and again, for those of you who didn't do the reading today, we're going to, because of my fuck up, we are going to go over each of these reasons in the review at the beginning of next class. So now that I've given you this spiel, and then you do the reading, and then we'll talk about it again, it should hopefully make sense. Any questions at this point, though? Also, the why should I care about this sort of stuff.
So I just want to like clarify.
absolutely.
So for analytical, it's kind of like a universal truth. So like, for instance, like dog is an animal, but for synthetic, it has to deal with more of like individual perception, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. Another difference is analytical truths are universally true. Another way of putting this is they're necessary. So a way that we typically think of something like basically another way of thinking about this is imagine that I get bonked on the head and my personality totally shifts. Well, the second thing, the fact that dogs are one of my favorite things could change, but there's nothing you could do to make it the case that dogs aren't animals. Like, that's not the nature of dogs. It's a necessary universal thing that dogs are animals. It's going to be the same universally for everyone, every possibility you can imagine. Dogs are animals. However, my opinions about it, or your opinions, they're going to shift. They can shift across time, across people. So this is going to be, analytic truths are necessary. And one way you can capture this fact is by saying it's just part of the definition. And why do we want this? Or, well, we have this intuitive idea of that there are things that are true by definition. And one way to capture this nicely is by saying that we have these concepts that are like definitions. And therefore, we know cats are animals because our very idea of a cat is an idea of an animal. The animal defines what it is to be a cat. That was a great point. Any other questions before we finish up? All right, so the review quickly, just concepts are the building blocks of thought. If we're going to understand how people think, we need to know what these building blocks are like. And if we want to know what the building blocks are like, we want to know how the complex ones are structured. And the first pass idea you might have is like that they're definitions. What is it to think that's a cat? Well, it's to think that's something that's fluffy and meows and is cute and poops in a litter box. That's what it is to think cat. And therefore, it's easy to explain why we can learn what a cat is. It also explains why it's easy to categorize new things as a cat. It explains why it seems so necessarily true that cats have to be animals, because part of our concept cat is that it's made up of the part, or somehow combined with the part, animal. And it also explains why, or it nicely captures our common sense idea about why we have arguments about things like, is water wet? And thoughts like that. All right, any last questions on this before I officially end class and just quickly talk about how next class is going to go? All right, so anyone who wants to leave, you are free to go. Class is officially over, dismissed. Have a good rest of your Monday. Brief preview of what next class is going to be like. So have a good one, everybody. Basically, what we're going to do next time is say, despite all of these positives, there's going to be a bunch of negatives as well. And the negatives are basically, we can just write them down really quickly. Fuzzy definitions, or I guess fuzzy concepts. No perfect definition. 3, and then 4 is there's got to be a better word than paradigmaticness for this, but that's the one I'm going to put up here. So what do I mean by fuzzy concepts? Basically, if the definitional approach is correct, then something should be very clearly defined. It should either be like, if we have a clear definition of what furniture is, because our concept furniture is just a definition, it should be very clear what counts as a piece of furniture and what doesn't. It should be clear. Chair, definitely a piece of furniture. Table, definitely a piece of furniture, because furniture is something like household object, used for reclining in your house, etc. But if you actually look, there are many things that you don't really know whether to call it furniture or not. Is a painting furniture? Is a carpet furniture? Well, if it was a definition, it should be a clear yes, it is, or no, it's not. In the same way, like in math, there's no question. It's either even or it's odd. There's no like, I don't really know. It's like, no, you're either an even number, you're an odd number, or you're a fraction. There's nothing in between. clear definitions, it's binary, yes, no. That suggests that if our concepts are like definitions, they should be binary too. But what we actually find is that people have fuzzy concepts, which suggests that our concepts are not just definitions. Another thing is, even the most outside of the realm of mathematics, even the most perfect definition doesn't seem to apply to everything. So for instance, our definition of a bachelor is an unmarried male, an unmarried adult male. But imagine it's a society that doesn't have marriage. In this society, is an unmarried adult male a bachelor? But if they have 3 kids with a particular person who's their partner, are you a bachelor if you and your partner have been together for 25 years, but you never got married? It just seems like there's no perfect definition for any of this. This one, the ignorance and error, I'm going to save till next time to talk about. This is going to be the one we're going to focus on a lot. And I didn't do the background today with the aboutness, so it's not going to make that much sense yet. So we'll save this one. And then the paradigmaticness. With numbers, when something, and what do I mean by a paradigm case or paradigmatic? Anyone, what is it? What is something that's a paradigm or paradigmatic? Anyone know? It's basically like a clear, obvious case. So like a paradigm of athleticism is like Usain Bolt. He's like the pinnacle, a clear example of it. A paradigm of, I don't know what else, but anyway, basically paradigmaticness. So something that's very paradigmatic is a very clear exemplar of something. So for instance, a fire truck is a paradigm case of something that's red. A maroon mug is not a paradigm case of something that's red. It's like kind of on the border. So that's what we mean by paradigm and paradigmatic. Well, with concepts, it looks like if concepts were definitions, something is either yes, it's a concept, or no, it's not. Like with numbers, a whole number is either even or it's odd. It's not either a better odd, more odd, or more even. It's rather just an even or odd. So in the same way, if we're saying that what a bird is something that's like got wings and feathers and etc., then every bird that's a bird should be just as much of a bird. And yet if you ask people how birdy is a penguin on a scale of 1 to 7, they'll say it's less birdy than a robin. If you say, which of these is a better bird? And this suggests that people, when they're judging, like, how much of it does it fall into the category? It seems like they're not just checking off things on a list. They're not just like, does it have wings? Yes. Does it have feathers? Yes. It rather seems that they're somehow comparing it to their ideal candidate bird. And when you're thinking that's a bird, it's not just a judgment of, does it meet the definition? It's rather a judgment of how close is it to my paradigm case of bird or my prototype of bird. So that's the fourth issue, is that there's these prototype things that have been studied in psychology that the classical view doesn't seem able to explain. Why on earth, if all it is to be a bird is to be something with wings and feathers, that people say that kiwi birds aren't very good birds, but pigeons are pretty clear birds? If our mind was structured in a way like definitions, they'd all be the same. So that's the final thing. We'll come back to all of this next time, but that's the preview of what we'll be doing. We'll just be saying, here was the classical view, review of why we like it. Here's some problems with it, which will lead into why a lot of people in like the 70s started going, oh no, we have to think of things like prototypes. And then we'll talk about what the implications are for how humans think and some of the ideas for things like learning and issues like that. All right, any other questions? Are we good? All right, then I will see everybody next week, or no, on Wednesday. I'll see you all Wednesday, and I have a good rest of your next 2 days.